100% disk usage in Windows. 12 things to try. Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. Got a question. My occasionally used laptop has been giving me fits for the last year. Regardless of what I do, I still get 100% disk usage. I don't have any weird stuff on my laptop other than VMware Workstation. I'd like to know if there's an update to the subject for Windows 11 so that I can reinstall Windows 11 without losing my apps and files to see if that will fix the problem. Or would you recommend I use my out-of-the-box backup and start over? I honestly recommend neither of those. The problem that we're having here can be caused by many different things. And I'm going to go through a list of some of the things that I think you should look at. They don't involve reinstalling or recovering a backup at all. They actually involve looking at specific things that often do cause 100% disk usage. Now, I do have to be very clear about something because the term usage is ambiguous. What we're talking about here is disk activity, the reading and the writing to the disk. On many computers, that's the flashing light on the front of the computer. It's just showing you that the disk is constantly active. That is different than drive space. We're not discussing space here at all. In fact, the concepts that I'm talking to you about today apply regardless of how much is actually on your hard disk. All of these things can cause 100% disk activity regardless of how much free space there is or isn't on your hard disk. Now, a good place to look at this to understand what it is I'm talking about is in Task Manager. In Task Manager, there is a column called Disk. If you click on that, you will get the programs running ordered by the amount of disk usage they are experiencing at this minute. In fact, it'll change every second as the programs do and don't do the things that they do and don't do. If you click it once and everything is 0, you've probably clicked it in the reverse order. Just click it again and you can actually sort by increasing or decreasing depending on whichever you happen to be seeing. What we're looking for, though, as shown in the example image, is the highest disk usage at the top. That at least gives you kind of a clue as to what program might be causing some of the problems. So, in that vein, number one, by far the most common instance of this, especially at startup, is your anti-malware tool doing its job. Especially if you don't have your computer running 24 hours a day. One of the things that happen is that the anti-malware tool fires up when you sign in, when you turn on your machine, and it does a scan. Well, a scan by definition is going to use the hard disk quite a bit. Again, depending on the anti-malware tool you have. Some of them are very good at staying out of the way if you're using your computer. Some of them, not so much. My recommendation, let it run. Eventually it will finish. Then your system will come back to you. Now, I do have two additional recommendations if you can't do that. One is search for a setting in the application that lets you control whether or not or when an automatic scan might happen. If there's an option to say, don't do it, or basically turn off the option that says do the scan if you missed it overnight, that might be something to do. Again, not what I recommend, but it's worth looking into. And of course, the second alternative is to just use a different anti-malware tool if the one you're using is causing problems. Number two, not in terms of priority, but because we're talking about malware, perform a scan. Do a full scan of your system. It is rare these days because malware typically has other goals. It's not unheard of for malware to actually be at the root of 100% disk usage. So, while we're talking about anti-malware tools, run a scan and see what pops up. Number three, check for the content indexer indexing files. The content indexer is a service that runs in the background, and its job is to, as its name implies, index the content on your machine. What it does is basically building a database of information that's in your files that it can then use when you search in Windows to make that search happen faster. Rather than having to search each file individually, the search tool uses this index that very quickly can locate the specific file that meets the criteria you're searching for. There is an option in the content searcher to not search the contents of files. In other words, your search will work fine on file names, but it won't necessarily work on the actual contents of your files. If you right-click on a drive and click on Properties and then General, you'll see that at the bottom there's a setting that will allow you to say, don't index the content of this drive. That way, the content indexer won't be spending its time. Now, my recommendation, same as before, let it run to completion. This is another one of those things that often happens when you sign into Windows, and it's often competing actually with your anti-malware tool for the disk, but it's the same idea. Once it's done, and it will make incremental updates as you change files, but it won't have to re-index the entire thing. Alternative number 2, uncheck the checkbox that I just told you about and live without having your content actually being indexed. And fine, alternative number 3 is an obscure one that I've seen referenced a couple of times. I've never actually done it myself, but that is to rebuild the index. If you click on Start, search for something called Indexing Options, and then in that, click on Advanced, and you'll see an item that says Rebuild. Sometimes, not unlike your browser cache actually, things can get confused or at least inefficient. So rebuilding the content index from scratch can sometimes improve not only the indexer's performance, but search performance as well. And finally, alternative number 3 is to disable search indexing completely. Don't index content, don't index anything. What you do here is right-click on Start, then Computer Management, then Services and Applications, and then double-click on Services in the right-hand pane. Scroll down until you find something called Windows Search and double-click on that. There, you will do 2 things. You will change the startup type to Disabled, and you will click on the button labeled Stop. That will stop the service right now, and by disabling it, prevent it from starting up again later. Click OK, and the entire search indexer will stop running and stop taking up time on your system. Number 4, take a look at your RAM and virtual memory impact. I was tempted to say this was very high on the list. It's not in terms of occurrence. By that I mean most people don't run into this. However, some people run into this all the time. And it really boils down to something very simple. You're asking your computer to do more than it is capable of doing with the RAM it has. Your computer tries to do what you want. When you ask it to do more that requires more RAM than you have, it starts using what's called virtual memory. I have articles on virtual memory all over the place, but the point about virtual memory is that it is your hard disk made to look like RAM. Now, that's great, especially in the short term, because it means that your program will continue and do something rather than fail with an out-of-memory message. However, the downside is that it's hitting your disk. Disks are slower. If you're running multiple programs or you're really trying to use a lot more RAM than your system actually has, it can get into a state that's called thrashing. In other words, it's spending more time managing virtual memory and hitting the disk than it is actually doing the job. Now, there are a couple of solutions for this. The easiest one, it's not free, but the easiest one is to actually add RAM to your system. If this is something that you run into occasionally, that might be a situation where more RAM might be the right solution for you if your computer is capable of having more RAM installed. There's a limit to every motherboard, but you'll need to find out where you are with respect to that. But this might be a sign that says, yeah, try adding more RAM. The alternative is don't do so much. This is especially true if you're running lots of different programs and they're all competing for memory at the same time. Try running fewer programs. Try having fewer tabs open. Try having fewer things installed at the time you are using your computer. All of these things can contribute to RAM usage, which if it gets too far, can then contribute to 100% disk usage as virtual memory starts hitting the disk very hard. Number 5, check for tools like Dropbox rebuilding their indexes. This is kind of like the search indexer, but it's one of those things that's built into the tools. Now, I have close to 3 terabytes of information in my Dropbox, and when I start up Dropbox, like on a new installation, it takes forever to index the files in my Dropbox. The indexes are great because it enables a number of Dropbox features that allow you to manipulate things that are stored in your Dropbox a little bit more quickly, but at the cost of that index potentially taking some time to create or to maintain. My recommendation, let it run. Same as the others, there's value to what it's doing. Maybe let it finish so that you can get on with your work. Alternative number 2, dramatically reduce the number of files you keep on your machine in Dropbox. That's something you'll have to manage around your workflow, what you need to have on your machine and what you might not necessarily have on your machine. The less you actually have on your machine, of course, the smaller the index is going to be and the less work that's going to be involved creating it or keeping it up to date. Alternative number 2, don't use Dropbox or other apps that might exhibit the same behavior. I'm not ruling out things like OneDrive or Google Drive. They may do similar things or not. But if this is a situation that you're running into and it's a pain, maybe an alternative is one thing to look at. And alternative number 3, this is an interesting one. Uninstall and reinstall Dropbox, pointing it at your existing Dropbox folder. What's interesting about this is that the uninstall reinstall will cause it to recreate the index from scratch. And just like several other of the items we've talked about so far, rebuilding an index from scratch often builds it in a more efficient, more complete, and potentially less corrupt way that then won't impact performance quite as severely in the future. Number 6, look for hard disk errors using Chkdsk/R. Hard disk errors can manifest as 100% disk usage. What happens is there'll be a sector on the disk that is marginal. It's readable, but only if you try to read it over and over and over and over again. And your disk drive and the disk drivers and the hardware, they will try everything to try and read even those marginal sectors. The problem, of course, is that they might try so hard they're retrying thousands of times that may actually impact the overall performance. If there's a cluster of marginal or bad sectors in one place, it can take an amazing amount of time to get past that. Chkdsk/R on that hard drive will at least scan the surface and try to mark those sectors as bad and then not use them in the future. Move the data to safe sectors, spare sectors, but in other words, avoid those marginal sectors that are impacting your performance. That's my recommendation, Chkdsk/R. Alternative number 2, back up the disk if at all possible and replace it. Alternative number 3, back up the disk and replace it with an SSD. We'll talk about that in a second. Everything I've just talked about with respect to Chkdsk/R applies only to traditional spinning platter hard disks. So, what about those SSDs? Number 7, consider upgrading to an SSD. This is one of those interesting things that actually may not fix the problem, but kind of sidesteps it. If the problem is severe enough that you notice it on an HDD, if you're on your existing machine, it is sometimes the case that the problem might not be so severe that it won't disappear, or at least seem a lot faster using an SSD. This is particularly true of boot time. The reaction from people who replace their hard disks with an SSD, the very first thing they say is, man, that booted fast. In comparison, it really does. And this is one of those things where if some of the problems you're experiencing are purely performance related, then getting a faster hard disk in the form of an SSD might be something to do. Honestly, it's really hard to go wrong. Even if you're not experiencing problems, replacing your hard disk with an SSD will speed up your system fairly significantly. Number 8, this one's obscure. I've never run into it myself, but I keep reading about it in all of the other resources that talk about this issue. And that is to turn off something called Superfetch. So we'll do it, and then I'll tell you what it is. Right-click on Start, click on Computer Management, click on Services and Applications, and then double-click on Services in the right-hand pane. This time, scroll down until you find something called sysmain, S-Y-S-M-A-I-N. That is the Superfetch service. Same thing as before with the other service, the content indexing service. Change it to disabled, click on Stop, and then click OK. You have turned off Superfetch. Great. What's Superfetch? Superfetch is, as I understand it, an attempt by the system to guess what you're going to do next. In other words, as you use your machine, it may notice that you use this program a lot or that program a lot. I'm not even sure what the heuristics that they actually take into account here, but the concept is that they're guessing. And most of the time, those guesses actually aren't bad, but there are scenarios where they guess wrong. Why are they guessing? They're guessing so that if they are right, they will have preloaded the program they think you're going to use next. For example, let's say that after you use Word, you always use Excel. You fire up Word, do whatever you're doing, but in the background, Superfetch is thinking, he usually fires up Excel. Let's get that loaded into memory so it'll come up quicker. The problem, of course, is every time it's wrong, it's done a bunch of unnecessary disk reads, and that can contribute. Number 9, check for the state of defragging. Now, this is one of those things where, yes, if you've got a traditional hard disk, spinning platter hard disk that hasn't been defragged for a while, sure, defragging can help. But that's rarely an issue anymore because Windows now schedules defrags automatically. However, much like your anti-malware software, much like the content indexer, if the machine is not turned on at the time the defrag is scheduled, then what will happen is the defrag will happen the next time you turn on the machine, which means that you actually run the possibility of trying to run the defragger, the anti-malware tool, and the content indexer all at the same time. No wonder there's 100% disk usage. So there are a couple of solutions to this one. My recommendation, honestly, is that you let it run. The default schedule only has it happening once a week. Just let it finish and you'll be good. On the other hand, you can certainly go in and play with the setting. You'll have to dive into Task Scheduler, which is not something I'm going to do here, but there is an image of it at least where you can see this is the setting that is causing this thing to automatically run if it missed its previously scheduled runtime. Number 10, reset the page and swap files. There's a theme to some of these solutions, and that is erase something and create it again. This time we're going to do that with the page and swap files. The way to do that is to turn your virtual memory settings to 0 so that you're not using any virtual memory files, reboot your machine, and then reset the virtual memory settings to whatever they were before. Same basic idea for the indexes we've been talking about earlier. When this happens, the files are generated from scratch, presumably potentially even in a better location, and they're created in such a way that they're clean. You're starting from scratch. There's less confusion about what's going on. I will say that I do consider this one grasping at straws. It may help, but it won't hurt. Number 11, update Windows. We're now getting into the grasping at straws section of this video. Updating Windows is important, and I really think you should be doing it anyway, all the time. In fact, if you are, this probably doesn't really even apply to you. But if you don't, or if it's been a while, then updating Windows is one of the things I recommend you do. Sometimes performance issues are the result of system bugs. Windows Update, its job is to give you updated software that hopefully has those bugs fixed. So my recommendation is very simple. Keep Windows as up-to-date as possible all the time. And finally, number 12. Check for firmware and driver updates. This is something that I generally don't recommend at all. with one exception. When you're chasing down a problem. What are we doing? We're chasing down a problem. Now, drivers should be updated automatically by Windows Update, but they're only updated to a point. In many cases, the actual manufacturer of the specific hardware you're dealing with might have even newer drivers that either they've chosen not to release to Microsoft or that are in the pipeline before getting pushed into Windows Update. Check the manufacturer, check your computer's manufacturer, the manufacturer for your disk interface if you have such a separate item. Basically check with your computer manufacturer and see if they don't have updated device drivers for your specific machine. That was a lot to talk about, a lot of things to consider. It's not as simple of just do this and we'll fix the problem. It is definitely a case of diagnosing what may be going on to cause 100% disk usage. But now, hopefully, you've got some things to try, and with any luck, one of them will help. For updates, for comments, for links related to this topic and more, visit askleo.com/168565. I'm Leo Notenboom, and this is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.